Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Kelly Weiss. I'm the Director of Marketing here at the School of Law, and we're so happy to have you all here for our inaugural Racial Justice Speaker Series event with Brendon Woods. Dean Johnson is going to introduce him in just a second. I wanted to let everyone know throughout the meeting we will be on mute. Mr. Woods will give a presentation, and then we will have an opportunity for some questions that we will be taking through the chat feature. I'll be coming back in just a little bit to tell you more about that, but it's my pleasure to introduce our Dean, Dean Kevin Johnson.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody for being here at the first lecture of our Racial Justice Speaker Series. I'm looking forward, and I'm sure many of you are as well, to a year-long discussion, if not a much longer discussion, of the racial justice issues that have hit the headlines recently, but have been with us for a long, long time. This nation, unfortunately, very sadly, has a long history of racial injustice. We can go through the pages of our history books and talk about slavery, the fugitive slave laws, the Jim Crow system, and we can also look at the modern criminal justice system, as we did a few weeks ago in looking at Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And recent events have brought to the fore some of the most prominent criminal justice issues, including the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others. So I'm pleased the UC Davis School of Law can present this series to discuss these issues. And we're incredibly lucky to have Brendon Woods, the public defender for Alameda County, and the first Black chief public defender in Alameda County's history, here with us today to talk about racial justice issues. He's currently the only Black chief public defender in the state of California. Mr. Woods has 20 years of experience in criminal defense litigation and leads 170 staff, providing superior legal defense in more than 3,000 new cases each month. Woods is committed to providing holistic representation to his clients and is a nationally recognized leader in public defense. He's a board member and former president of the California Public Defenders Association. He was honored with the Harvard Law School Wasserstein Public Interest Fellowship for outstanding public service. From a young age, Brendon Woods had formative experiences with law enforcement, steering his life and career toward public defense. He feels fortunate to fight for those battling systems of oppression today and strives to reshape the discourse and nature of public defense and criminal justice as a whole. He came to King Hall and visited on King Day and spoke to the students and staff who worked in the community that day. And I'm pleased that he's with us virtually today. Please welcome Brendon Woods.
So good afternoon. Thank you for having me and for allowing me to lead off your racial justice series. I'm truly honored. So as we know, these are very strange times, 2020. We have a national pandemic. We have fires ravaging the West Coast. We have storms flooding the East Coast. And in the middle of all this, we have what appears to be some sort of national awakening to race and racism in this country. And I do say appears to be because still I am not 100% convinced, which leads us to really the title of this talk. Yes, that worked. The title of the talk, A Riot is the Language of the Unheard. Is racial justice possible in America? So I could not be here virtually at UC Davis Law. Would King Hall and not in some way incorporate Martin Luther King? Now it's going to be difficult to convey the same energy via Zoom that would be possible to do in person. I'm going to do my best. So the question of the talk really is racial justice possible in America? We're going to try to answer that question. Is racial justice possible in America? The answer is no. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much. I'll see you guys later. No, it's fine. So if we were in person, if we were present, I would ask you for a show of hands to answer that question. Is racial possible? Is racial justice possible in America? And then I could see a show of hands, and I'd be confident if there were actually a show of hands, there would be a breakdown based on race. It would come down to your perspective and how much you personally have encountered or had to deal with racism on a daily basis. So fortunately for us, the Pew Research Center in 2019 did a study on race in America, and they answered some of these questions for us. So right now, according to that study from 2019, whites are much more likely than blacks to say that we will achieve racial equality in America. 64% of blacks say that the country has not gone far enough in giving black people equal rights with whites. 50% say it's not true or not likely that we'll ever achieve racial equality. On the flip side, 80% of white people say it's very likely, or somewhat likely, that black people will eventually have equal rights in this country. About 8 in 10 black people say we haven't gone far enough in giving black people equal rights. That's almost 80%. And you contrast that to 37% amongst whites. 19% say of whites have said we've gone too far, and 43% say it's just about right, excuse me. So black people and white people see things very differently when it comes to race. We also see that it's different on the particular issue in a variety of settings. So for example, 84% of black people say they are treated less fairly when dealing with the police. 63% of white people believe that blacks are treated less fairly. So it's about a 37% difference. 37% of those people who believe that white people are treated fairly are either living under Iraq or are working with the Trump administration. I don't know. 87% of blacks say that blacks are treated less fairly by the criminal legal system, and 61% of whites say that they're treated the same. 82% of blacks say they're treated less fairly in hiring and pay and promotions, and 44% of whites say that blacks are treated equally, and so on and so on. And we get to this slide here. Blacks are twice as likely as any other racial group to say that the legacy of slavery affects black people today. More than 8 in 10 black people, 84%, say slavery affects the position of black people in this country at least a fair amount. So is racial justice possible in America? There we go. I think we can find an answer to that question in Martin Luther King's quote. His quote, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And we have to come back to thinking about what is it that America has failed to hear. America has failed to hear the voices of black people in this country for generations. I gave a similar talk on the same topic about 5 years ago at Hastings. And it feels like instead of things getting better, they may have actually gotten worse. America has failed to recognize or come to grips with its extremely racist past and history. It's failed to recognize this, and its failure to recognize it's not an accident, but instead it's by design. There's never, ever been any sort of true form of reconciliation with black people in America. A recognition of how this country and world economy and capitalism was built on violence, it was built on torture, cruelty, and dehumanization of black people. We have to start this conversation about equality and equity. We must start with slavery, and we must not minimize the long-lasting impact it has had on this country. So hopefully as you continue the series and you have more speakers come in, this will help center the topic of racism in America. You have to be able to deal with slavery. And so my plan today, as we talk, is to discuss slavery, discuss lynching, discuss the creation of modern-day policing, mass incarceration, protests, riots, and so on. No, this talk will not take about 8 hours, and I can't really cover everything, especially as deep and important as these topics are, but I'll be scratching the surface on some. And I want to spend some time talking about the first topic, which is slavery. And so in preparation for this talk, I thought about slavery and slaves and the education that I received around the topic. And a few things that really jumped out at me is that the education I received was woefully, and I mean woefully inadequate. And I would guess the way we all were taught around slavery was woefully inadequate. And that was absolutely intentional. As a Black person, we were taught that there was something shameful about slaves in America, or being a slave, or being a descendant of a slave. And I think even myself subconsciously to this day, when I hear the word slave, it sounds like an other, or it sounds like someone who was less than human. It sounds like someone who deserved that treatment over their lot in life, that they deserved that abuse. They were weak-minded and could not fight for themselves. So I consciously and actively try to avoid the word slave. And I refer to them as enslaved people over and over again. They're enslaved people, because for generations, children and adults in this country have been spared the whole terrible reality about what slavery's place in US history is and what it was. And I think about the education I received around slavery. Growing up, I spent some time in Virginia growing up, and some of it was like riding the school bus, going to school. I remember very vividly riding a school bus in Virginia, going to a predominantly white school, a very Christian school, a very Christian Baptist school. That's a whole different talk. But the topic of slavery came up, and this older kid on the bus had a very, very affirmative position that slavery was good. He thought it was good because it saved the colored people. And he said in his conversation, if it wasn't for slavery, Black people would still be swinging from trees in Africa. So think about the power in that statement as it was said to me, a Black sixth grader, from a white eighth grader, and how that statement in and of itself reeks of white supremacy. And as a young boy, it hurt, it cut deep, and no one on the bus said anything about it. It sounded wrong, but no one acknowledged it, and no one had the tools to actually combat what it was being said. And if we thought about that, that's what we were actually taught. We were taught that. So do excuse me, I'm still getting used to the back and forth technology here with Zoom. So this was from a textbook from the 80s in Virginia. It said Virginia offered a better life for the Negroes than did Africa. In his new home, the Negro was far away from the spears and war clubs of the enemy tribes. He had some of the comforts of civilized life. That's what was taught. These are the images we had from slavery. Now, it was something that was nice, something that was not as offensive or violent as it really was. And the education that we received around slavery has not gotten much better today. What's on the screen now was what appeared in the textbook about 5 years ago. 5 years ago. It said the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Millions of workers. Another textbook from 2000 said this: most masters did not want to punish their slaves severely. In those days, whipping was also the usual method of correcting children. The planter looked upon a slave as children and punished them as such. So over and over again, we have these examples of slavery and how it was taught, or really how it wasn't taught. Because none of these examples give us a true depiction of what slavery really was in the United States. And if we don't begin to confront our history around slavery, we will never understand where we are as a nation now. So it's often been said that slavery was our country's original sin, but it's much more than that. Slavery is our country's origin, and that's from Hassan Kwame Jeffries. Slavery was not an aberration in American history. It was the heart of our history. It's a main event. It's a central foundational story. Slavery was responsible for the growth of America, the transforming of the colonies. It was a driving power behind the nation's new expansion, industry, and economic growth. Slavery is what made the United States a powerful force. And the central role slavery played in the development of the United States is beyond dispute. And when we think about that, probably the implications that America does not like to talk about slavery or think about it, much less teach it, the implications of what slavery is unnerving. It's uncomfortable. If the cornerstone and foundation or building blocks of this nation was slavery, then what does that say about how we look at our founding fathers, the people who we revere, the people who actually supported and built white supremacy? Now, slavery is hard. It is hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It is hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It is hard to teach white supremacy that justified it. And it's hard to learn about those people who supported and abided by it, but that is our history. Understanding American slavery is vital to understanding racial inequality today. We have to do it. So right now, this part of my talk I actually debated doing for a while. I went back and forth, and I'm going to discuss slavery in some graphic detail. Not extreme graphic, but some graphic. I've cut back some of the graphic details. And I struggled with it because as a Black person, it can be triggering to hear these details when you know about them already, even if you don't. But I do think it is important for people who are not Black to learn about them, to hear about them, to be aware of the atrocities that occurred to Black people here in the United States. And if you don't want to hear about them, that's okay, you can mute. I will put back on the screen, come back when we're done talking about it. It'll be a few minutes, okay? So as many of us are aware, about 12 million African American men, women, and children were kidnapped from their homes, their communities, their villages. About 10 million made it from West Africa or sold in slavery. About 2 million died in that brutal journey. You know, we were never taught these atrocities, and we were never taught about how in the slave ships, the confinements for men and women, they were put in spaces in the Middle Passage that were about 6 feet long, 1 foot, 4 inches wide. They were shackled, unable to move. They did this journey below ground on the bottom of the ship most of the time. They had no place to go to the bathroom. Food was fed to them in the same quarters. They often laid in their feces and urine and vomit during the 2-month to 4-month journey. Many of slave owners were just brutal in the way they treated people. Often it was a habit where they might kill one slave, set an example, and then they'd try to feed the body of that slave to the other enslaved people that were on the ship. Many enslaved people committed suicide on the journey by using their fingernails to slash their wrists or jumping overboard, or by starvation. When the enslaved people arrived in America, men, women, and children, even infants, were put on the shopping block, auction block at slave markets. Families were separated, children were sold away from their parents, husbands and wives were separated. Enslaved people were frequently tortured, whipped. After they were whipped, salt, pepper, and citrus and hot ashes were poured on their bodies, and mutilations were common. Such atrocities were legal, and in some instances they were encouraged by the states and local governments. Many states enacted what were called the slave codes. Slave codes were defined the status of slaves and the rights and responsibilities of slave owners. Some examples of slave code or types of slave codes were people were given curfews. Enslaved people were forbidden to leave the owner's property unless accompanied by a white person. An enslaved person attempting to run away and leave the colony or the state was possibly executed. Any enslaved person who evaded capture for 20 days or more would be publicly whipped for the first offense, branded with an R on the right cheek for the second offense, lose an ear for the third offense, and castrated for the fourth offense. Slaves' homes are often searched for weapons or stolen goods. Punishment for having something would escalate from losing an ear to branding and death penalty. No enslaved person could work for pay. They could not plant corn, grow peas or rice, keep hogs or cattle or horses, or own or operate any property, or have their own clothes that were finer than what was called Negro cloth. So, the slave codes were atrocious. The treatment of slaves, or not African-American people, but enslaved people in America was atrocious. And there was a group of people who were set up to enforce the slave codes. And they were called the slave patrols. They were considered by many to be the first police forces in America. They were formed differently depending on the state and colony. They often worked very similar to a draft. Some governments ordered local militias to set up patrollers. They were composed of mostly all white men, and all white men, almost all, had to serve. They were believed to be first formed in the 1700s, and their main functions were to chase down and apprehend enslaved people. They were to return them to their owners. They were to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and to maintain a form of discipline for enslaved people. They were subject to immediate discipline, immediate law, and they could discipline them right on the spot for any violation. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of the way slave patrols functions is that they were explicit in their design to empower the white male population, not just with police power, but the duty to police the comings and goings and movements of Black people. As the best expert on slave patrols, Sally Hayden, wrote in her book, "The history of police work in the South grows out of this early fascination by white patrollers with what African-American slaves were doing. Most law enforcement was by definition white patrolmen watching, catching, or beating Black slaves." That is the foundation, the birthplace, really, of our policing force today. And perhaps a more accurate picture or determination is that the US police force started as a series of armed groups whose central purpose was to protect white people from non-white people via violence. So I'm going to ask for some assistance right now. Can you guys see me? Can I get a show of hands? You can see me. Great, thank you. So as we know, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1865, slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. And I've heard so many people argue today that slavery ended in 1865, so it's no longer relevant for today's conversations around Blacks and racism in America, that Black people need to get over it. slavery has no bearing on what is happening today. And that is absolutely false. So think about this. For 246 years, slavery was legal in America. It wasn't made illegal until about 155 years ago. America has been a slave society longer than it has not been. Now, my grandmother, she was born in 1916. Her mother, definitely her grandmother, lived through slavery. And the trauma related to slavery was undoubtedly present in her life. So even though slavery was abolished in 1865, it wasn't as if everything just got better overnight. The atrocities that occurred during slavery just took on new names, new laws, new forms of legally sanctioned terror and control. The slave codes were replaced with the Black codes. Black codes were laws that prohibited basic rights for Black people, such as assembling in groups, bearing arms, learning to read and write, free speech, or going to court and testifying against white people. So after emancipation came the system of Jim Crow laws in the South and the use of lynchings that were not just one-offs, but they occurred frequently. The Equal Justice Society recently put out a study, a report, and they documented almost 4,000 lynchings in 12 southern states between 1877 and 1950. And these lynchings were spectacles. Large crowds of white people would gather, numbering in thousands. They would include elected officials, prominent citizens. They were pre-planned. They were heinous killings that featured torture and mutilation. Often, the press would cover these lynchings. They were justified. Vendors would sell food. They would print postcards. And Black people were lynched for the most minor offenses. So in 1916, Jeff Brown was lynched for accidentally bumping into a white girl as he ran to catch a train. Okay. I'm sorry, my PowerPoint is not being presented. Let me try this again. Can you see it now? Yes, great. In 1919, a white mob lynched William Little, a soldier returning from World War I, for refusing to take off his army uniform. In 1933, Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched for daring to scold some white children that were throwing rocks at her. In 1940, Jesse Thornton was lynched for referring to a white police officer by his name without the title of Mr. Lynching and racial terror profoundly compromised what came to be the criminal justice system. They did this without any reliable findings of guilt, and at legal executions authorized by police and politicians. These lynchings were performed primarily often by mobs and by the KKK. The KKK initiated terror throughout this time period. And eventually, the KKK moved on to trade in their white robes for Black robes and blue uniforms. And the legacy of slavery existed and continues to exist and transformed into our politics. So I want to give you an example of the legacy of slavery right now. In 1904, in Mississippi, a Black man was accused of shooting a white landowner who had attacked him. The white mob captured him and the woman he was with. They mutilated them, cut off their limbs, drilled corpses into their flesh, and then burned them alive. while hundreds of spectators enjoyed this, drank lemonade, and ate food. The landowner's brother, his name was Woods Eastland. He presided over the violence. He oversaw the lynching. Later on, he was elected to be the district attorney of Scott County, Mississippi. From that position, he allowed his son, James Eastland, who was an avowed white supremacist, to serve in the United States Senate, becoming the president pro tem of the United States Senate from 1972 to 1978. That was during my lifetime. This man said on the Senate floor, "I have no prejudice in my heart, but the white race is the superior race and the Negro an inferior race, and the races must be kept separate." He said, with regards to World War II, he said the Negro soldier was physically, morally, and mentally incapable of serving in combat. In contrast, he claimed that the boys from the South were fighting to maintain white supremacy. This man, for about 20 years, was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee until 1978. He adamantly opposed the appointment of Thurgood Marshall. This was in my lifetime. So when we talk about slavery, it has its effects today, and it wasn't that long ago. Another place we see it the most, where I see it in my work, where I see it probably on a daily basis, is in the criminal legal system. When we talk about the 13th Amendment and how it was built, how it's lauded to abolish slavery, but when we read it, we know that it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, wherefore the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except for people who were convicted of crimes. Mass incarceration, as we see it today, is directly related to slavery. This slide here sees how, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. I am. I did. Did that work? Yes, thank you. All right. There's an extra button. I apologize for the back and forth with the PowerPoint. A lot of screens and a lot of buttons here, and I'm showing my age with the technology. So when we talk about mass incarceration, this slide here brings it out to me the most. This starts the war on drugs with President Nixon. And this quote is from one of his aides, John Ehrlichman. And it says the Nixon White House, after that, we're talking about after or the war and the civil rights movement, had two enemies, the anti-left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This was in 1972. In 1972, there were 200,000 people in prison. Currently, today, there are 1.5 million people in prison. There are over 800,000 black people in jails and prisons in the United States. In total, there are about 1.6 million black people, black men, under state or federal supervision or control. There are more black men in prison and jail on probation and parole right now than there were slaves at the start of the Civil War, and it's not even close. The cost of this mass incarceration system right now is about $81 billion. $81 billion annually. So we see how we've gone from the slave economy to this incarceration economy. I think Brian Stevenson said it best here. Slavery gave America a fear of Black people and a taste for violent punishment. Both still define our criminal justice system. And then we get to what's been happening all along, but what we've been paying more attention to recently, especially since 2014, what Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice all occurring that year. And this has been the recent spark, the recent catalyst. And it's happened so often. And we see it over and over again. Since 2015, the Washington Post began to attempt to log every fatal shooting by an on-duty police officer in the United States. Since 2015, in that time, there have been more than 5,000 shootings recorded. And from the analysis of the data, there has not been a decrease annually. There's been all this attention placed on police shooting and police killing, and there has not been a decrease. And the racial disparity still exists. Now, although half of the people shot and killed by police are white, Black Americans are shot at a hugely disproportionate rate. Now, Blacks account for less than 13% of the US population, but they're killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. Police have shot and killed young Black men between the ages of 18 and 29, like Michael Brown, 175 times since January 2015. Over that same period, police have shot and killed 172 young white men. Just as the slave patrols in that time period were watching, catching, or beating Black enslaved people, modern day police are watching, arresting, beating, searching, and shooting unarmed Black people. Recent issues, recent killings have sparked protests like we've never seen before. And really, the pandemic and George Floyd was the catalyst. And we've seen protest after protest after protest. And it's estimated that between 15 million to 26 million people in the United States have participated in these protests. And within that, there have been some cases or some situations where the protests have turned into looting, or what's called looting or riots. And there are these messages that looters are there and they are bad for the movement and they distract from the message, and we condemn the looters and rioters, and they say, you are not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And really we have to think about that. And the problem, and the message I want to convey to you is the problem isn't the looting. The problem is, why are these people looting? And it goes back to the Martin Luther King quote, a riot is the language of the unheard. If after 400 years of slavery, after lynching, after the continued creation of unjust laws and racist laws, after economic inequality, after environmental racism, after genocide, mass incarceration, after the continued nonstop killing of unarmed Black men in the street, and you want to focus on rioting and looting? I say no, no. If you want the rioting and looting to stop, you must focus on the reasons behind, the reasons why people are rioting and looting. If we can't have a conversation about why, then we will never be able to achieve racial justice in America. We can't do it. So earlier on, when I discussed the history of slavery, I didn't discuss one thing, and that's one thing that's been left out of the education completely about slavery, and that during slavery, there were acts of resistance. There were big acts of resistance, like Nat Turner and his revolt, or the Stoner Rebellion, or the revolt that occurred in South Carolina, big, huge slave revolts. And also there were more subtle ways that Blacks in America resisted, with everyday acts of defiance that were far more common than the big rebellions. And there were ways in which they tried to minimize the amount of energy they spent working, how they slowed the pace of work, how they might feign illness or break farming equipment, how they might injure animals or sabotage crops. We have to discuss how enslaved people attacked their enslavers' property, burning their homes, burning their barns, burning their storage sheds. These were purposeful acts of economic retaliation intended to strike enslavers where it hurt the most, in their wallets and purses. So I'm not saying here that I condone looting or rioting, but I do understand. And I'm asking that we as a society create more understanding around what is happening. Just like in the beginning of this talk, I said I don't use the term slave, but instead use the term enslaved people. I would argue that we should not use the term looter or rioter, but instead people, use the term people that are just pissed off. They're pissed off from 400 years of oppression, pissed off from mass incarceration, pissed off from being killed in the streets by police. That's what is happening. So in order to understand racism, in order to get to the heart of racism, in order to get to a society or a place where racial justice is possible in America, we have to begin to change that dialogue. We have to learn our history. That's what we have to do. So I'm going to wrap this up here. Many of you on this call, on the Zoom meeting, are in law school, and you're going to be lawyers, or you're already lawyers, and you're going to be in a position to create change. You're going to be in a position to have some impact. And I encourage you to use that position, your education, your law degree, to have some impact. And in doing so, you have to pay attention. Pay attention to laws that are being passed, pay attention to what's happening in Sacramento, pay attention to what's happening in your own locality. And so what I'm referring to right now, think about where you're at, where you're going to school. In Davis, right now, the district attorney, Jeff Reisig, went on a vicious attack of your public defender, Tracy Olson, when after a Black Lives Matter rally, she had the audacity to point out to the media that Yolo County is 3% Black and the jail is 25% Black. All she did was call out racism. And that DA went on a vicious media attack, asking her, demanding that she appear in front of the Board of Supervisors and justify why she thought there was racism in the system. Calling out racism isn't the problem. People who say there isn't racism, they're the problem. And right now we think about what's coming up. We have an election right around the corner, a huge election. And on that ballot are things we need to be paying attention to are remnants of slavery, such as Prop 17. Prop 17 will give people on the parole the right to vote. Prop 20, the Cooper Initiative, talks about adding a lot more crimes to the penal code right now and making such misdemeanors back to felonies and making more people have to register their DNA. Prop 25 is bail reform. And of course, coming up is the election, the presidential election. And we all need to be paying attention to that, because we all know right now the person who's running this country is an absolute racist. And finally, if I can encourage you to do one thing, one more thing, learn your history, learn the real history of this nation. Make sure your children learn the history and demand that history be taught in your schools. So I started out with a snippet of the quote from Martin Luther King, and I'm going to play the whole quote now, or read the whole quote. It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 12 or 15 years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. So, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to kick off your series and to say a few words today.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I don't want to take up time with my questions, although I think your very sobering assessment of our history leaves us much to think about. It makes me very sad, and as one of our students who commented on chat said, it's heartbreaking to hear, and thank you for putting the mirror to us, because we should give this serious thought. But do we have questions? Students can put them on chat. I'd be happy to ask.
Dean Johnson, we do have a question here from Jeanette, who says, what can law schools do to ensure that their solidarity statements and town halls go beyond the performative and actually make lasting change? And that could go to Mr. Woods.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in law school right now, you, as I said earlier, are in a great position because you have access or will have access. And I'm thinking about where you are located right now. You are a half hour from Sacramento, right? You are so close to Sacramento. You are where laws are being made and changed right now. Right now, there are 2 bills on the governor's desk that we supported that are waiting to be signed. One's called the Racial Justice Act that will directly attack racial disparities in the criminal legal system. And then another one is called AB 3070. It talks about jury reform, and it will make a path to have more Black people represented on juries. You can be mobilizing actions right now to send letters to the governor to encourage him to sign those bills. I mean, so when I talk about paying attention, you've got to be focused on that. And at the same time, during this last legislative session, there were some real serious police reform bills that did not make it. I mean, police reform bills that did not make it now, in this climate, during this time. One of those bills was a bill to decertify police. And what that means is that police officers who have had some sort of bad conduct on their record or moral misconduct, they could not go from one police department to another. Right now they can. They can get fired in Oakland and then go work in San Leandro or Pleasanton or someplace else, or Sacramento. This bill would have prevented that, and that bill stalled. It didn't get heard, didn't get passed. California is only one of 5 states that doesn't have a decertification process that allows this to happen. So when you talk about getting involved, that's one way you can do it.
We have another question here from Alexander, who says, what are your thoughts in your professional role on calls to defund the police?
My thoughts on that are, I think the defund, we talk about it, and we're never going to defund the police in its entirety, right? So I want to make sure we're clear around that. But do we spend an inordinate amount of money on police that is unnecessary? Absolutely. Can that money be redirected to communities? Absolutely. If I think about the amount of money spent on policing, prosecution, and control here in Alameda County, it is off the charts. Oakland Police Department, their budget's about $300 million. The sheriff's budget's about $400 million. Those are extraordinary large amounts of money that don't have to be spent there. And as you guys have heard the conversations about sending police to respond to, sending force to respond to someone who has a mental health outbreak. That's not the way we want to solve the issue. You know, we don't need to be sending violence to solve mental health issues, or violence to solve drug addiction issues, or violence to solve homelessness. So when it comes to defunding the police, I say defund and maybe reassign that money to community.
Mr. Woods, we have a few more comments coming in. I wanted to just share one from, it looks like, I think maybe this is an alum of ours, or someone who graduated in 1985, who says, how can I contact you? I am one of 6 persons of color in the Utah State Legislature, and I would like some guidance on legislation and reform. So you might be hearing from Johnny, I believe, if I'm getting that correctly. I wonder, is that something that we could follow up with you?
Absolutely. I'd like to put my email in the chat. If I was more technically savvy, I would do it.
Okay, maybe Starla, would you mind? Could you do that? That's excellent. Okay, thank you. We have another comment here from Liza, who says, in your opinion, how does the standard of objective reasonableness in the review of police conduct or others affect the perpetuation of racial injustice, or does it?
Holy shit. Give me that one more time.
So I know I had to read it carefully. So in your opinion, how does the standard of objective reasonableness in the review of police conduct affect the perpetuation of racial injustice?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, that standard is one that's been used to legitimize, justify, and allow police to act with impunity, with violence, unchecked, literally against Black and brown people still. That's the way I understand it to be. There needs to be strengthening around that language, and also one thing that I think needs to be done if we're talking about reform is having police civilian review commissions with real authority and real power. Not some perfunctory commission that cannot take action, but one with real authority and real power, and one that is also funded to do the job.
We have one more question here that's from Jim, who says, what do you make of the new alliance of progressive DAs in California who apparently are pushing for criminal justice reform?
That's a whole nother talk. I have a certain opinion and thoughts on progressive DAs. I think this group actually does intrigue me because this group is a counter to CDAA. And if you don't know what CDAA is, it's the California District Attorneys Association. And they have been CDAA has been literally opposing almost every single progressive law that has been attempted to be passed in California. Within CDAA, there are some quote unquote progressive prosecutors. And I keep thinking about this term progressive prosecutors. When I have time, I'm going to write an essay about this. What does that mean? Okay. What does the progressive prosecutor mean? It means you're more progressive than the asshole that had the job before you. That means you're not as strict. That means you're not going to send people with marijuana convictions to jail. Means you're not going to punish and send people to jail for committing petty theft. Okay, yeah, you're quote unquote progressive. We shouldn't reward these people for essentially doing their damn job, okay? Your job is to administer justice fairly. It's not to over-incarcerate or prosecute unfairly. So when it comes to progressive, I think it's a label that is not used properly all the time. And I don't really care about progressive. I want reform. I want prosecutors who are going to reform the system, to think about how they're doing it, and to really focus on ending mass incarceration. So when it comes to this group, I do find some encouragement. I think Chesa might be one of the few, what I'm going to call reform prosecutors out there, because he was a former public defender and I know him. But I am not sure about this group. I'm optimistic, and we'll see what happens. I think we spend a lot of time focusing on police reform and policing, but there's got to be real focus also paid attention to prosecutors and how they're doing their job and how they're contributing to mass incarceration. I mentioned Jeff Reisig, who is, I believe, your DA, who is in line to be president of the statewide association next year. And this man denies racism in his county.
Well, thank you. It's 1:15 now, so it's time to wrap up, but thanks, Mr. Woods.
Thank you all. I'm sorry about the tech difficulties. I'm still getting used to this new normal. So thank you for having me, and have a great series.
Yep. Well, next week we have Mayor Steinberg from Sacramento, and in the spring, among others, we'll have Yolo County Public Defender to talk about the issues that you've mentioned she'll talk about.
Right.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here.